Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Excellent. How are you?
Pretty good. I'm not quite as good as you. I'm not quite excellent, but I'm pretty good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Jeff Warren. You
Mhm.
are here for a number of reasons. There's a lot of stuff I want to talk with you about that we have common interests in. The nature of consciousness, for example. What would it mean to be awakened in the Buddhist sense of the term? But I want to start off at a slightly more not mundane, but slightly less cosmic level by talking about your book, your best-selling book, co-authored with Dan Harris, called Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics, because one thing you are is a meditation teacher.
Mhm.
In fact, that's probably the main thing you are. And that's the parts of this book you handle. It's Dan Harris is known to a lot of people. Well, he's been with me on this podcast. They may know him from that, but also he had this mega bestseller, 10% Happier. Now, this is a kind of a follow-up, Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics. And there's an interesting division of labor between you two. The hands-on kind of meditation instruction in the book comes from you. You've got your own special font. You've got this sans serif font. He is Dan is in serif and does the overarching narrative and talks about your this whole escapade you guys went on as a prelude to writing the book, where you got on a bus and traveled through America and accosted passersby and so on. So what I want to do is talk a little about the book and about meditation and your approach to teaching it, and then maybe we'll get more cosmic as we go along. Now, one reason I'm interested in your approach to teaching it is because there are a number of people who watch this show or listen to this podcast, and judging by the comments they leave in the comments section, they are skeptics of meditation. And that could be, and this book is for skeptics, so that makes you, that's one reason you're a good person to talk to. Another is that I gather you yourself had a certain dissatisfaction with the way meditation was often taught and talked about when you first encountered it. I
Mhm.
mean, we should say that you, like me, actually first got sold on meditation by going to a retreat of some, what was it, a 1 week retreat or what? And so you kind of got into it that way. But even after that, I think you were uncomfortable with some of the ways that teachers tended to frame it. So why don't you talk a little about what you didn't like about the way it was talked about, and maybe that will itself will resonate with some of the skeptics out there.
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is I think it's good to be skeptical about meditation. I think that there's no point in taking on anybody's word. You have to kind of see for yourself. And I don't actually think that it's necessarily, well, first of all, there's lots of kinds of practices, but it doesn't necessarily mean that any of those practices will be the right practice for you. I do think some kind of practice is really helpful in life, and I can talk more about that. But I know that just sitting and trying to do, say, a concentration meditation where you're just focused on the breath, your mind wanders, you come back, that may not be the right practice for some people. Um, so just to get that out there, first of all, and then also just to say the title of the book is really, it's not so much for people who are skeptical of meditation. It's more for people who are skeptical that meditation could work for them. So not skeptical in the big picture about it, but just saying that they're not sure it would work for them because they're very ADD or they're distractible or they don't think they have the time. So it was trying to kind of address that population, people who are curious about it but didn't think it would work for them, and really addressing that as opposed to just challenging the whole idea of meditation outright. Um, but yeah, I mean, like you said, I mean, I came at it as a journalist. I was writing a book about consciousness. I'd already written a lot of the book, it was looking at waking and sleeping and dreaming and the relationship of these states. And I was interested in the bridging the neuroscience, what we knew about the science, with the experience, the first person inner experience. And so I used myself as a guinea pig. And I felt like I had to do my due diligence in that book by exploring a few Buddhist understandings of mind and Buddhist perspectives on it, just because they're famously the great introspectionists, at least in the East, along with sort of Indian culture more generally. So when I first, so I'd read a bunch of books about it, and like a lot of people, I just was determined for a while to only read books and never to actually do it because it seemed like a lot of work. But eventually I figured I needed to actually check it out. So I went to a retreat in Scotland, a group called the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. I think this was 2003 or four. And yeah, first I was a terrible meditator. I found the way it was presented, some of the languaging around it, uh, you know, uh, what was most compelling for me were the people that were there and the sincerity of the practitioners. The language I found kind of confusing. Often it was done in a sort of jargony way with this sort of where they would just lay out the vocabulary as though these categories of experience were somehow definitive, the way we might say two arms and two legs are definitive.
So what kinds of words would they throw around that you weren't really relating to?
Well, anything, I mean, the way one person would talk about shamatha and tranquility or concentration practice was a little different than, say, another. I mean, what really happened was down the line, as I started learning from different teachers, I would find all these ambiguities in the way different teachers approached it. So people would talk about shamatha in different ways with the concentration piece. People would talk about mindfulness in different ways and vipassana. People would talk about, I mean, you name it. People would talk about cause and effect in different ways. People would talk about oneness in different ways. They would talk about awakening in different ways. They would talk about impermanence in different ways. And I imagined when I went into it, because I was coming as more of a science journalist, that I was looking for this common language, where we could agree on a set of terms and there was agreed upon definitions for each one. And I wasn't really getting that. I was very interested in talking to different teachers and reading different books, but I felt like I kept getting these different signals. And I now realize it was totally understandable that this would happen. You're talking about subjective experience, which is very murky. And not only is it murky, it's not just a process of discovery, it's also a process of training. So the act of introspecting, of looking at what's going on, is changing what's happening. So it's a very complicated situation, and there's lots of different scholarly interpretations of what's happening, and then there's lots of different personal experiences of what's happening, and you're kind of getting every teacher's weird personalized Venn diagram of those two things. So I found that fascinating, but also very frustrating, because and what I found most frustrating was that the way in which teachers were describing what was supposed to be happening wasn't really what my own experience looked like. I mean, it was maybe in the most general terms, but it wasn't really in the specific terms of what I felt like was happening for moment to me. And it didn't explain in what I was looking for, which is sort of straight ahead common sense language, the dynamics of practice itself. What was happening? What was going on? What were the dynamics of what was happening? And that became sort of my obsession. And I eventually found a teacher who spoke about it in a way that I really like. And he was sort of the skeleton key for me. And once I had that, then I could kind of decode or translate every other teacher. And now it's very easy for me to hear someone talk and kind of get a sense of what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. But in those early days, that wasn't happening. And it was, now partly that's just also because I needed to learn more experience myself. I needed to start to become a better meditator so I could see some of these things more clearly.
Mm-hmm. That teacher who was kind of provided the breakthrough for you was Shinzen Young, who's actually I've had a conversation with on this platform. It's there in the archives, and one thing about him is he's very analytically minded. He's not bound by existing categories of analysis and description that that we've inherited from kind of ancient texts. Although he relates his instruction to them. And he certainly, I think a lot of people, I found him very, very illuminating. I encourage people to check him out. So how, when people look at this book, in what ways is the approach in this that you take to teaching meditation, and that you take broadly to teaching meditation, going to differ from at least some of the common approaches they might encounter?
I don't think it's radically different. Dan loves to talk the big game about it. I mean, I think the book is terrific. It's a really fun kind of narrative approach, but my approach is basically to be kind of playful and try to be rigorous in the language that I use, to speak like a normal person. It's very inspired by, why Shinzen is such a wonderful teacher is there's the absolute rigor of his language, but there's also the fact that he's very uncompromising about talking about absolutely everything that can happen in experience, including some of the deep end stuff. And that was, for me, what I needed. I need someone who is able to draw the line between these more lofty notions in Buddhism that are out there and everyday experience for the average person, because it needed to be part of a single continuum for me to get it. And he was the one that really helped me see that and I can unpack that.
Mm-hmm.
To go more into your question, I think, I think there's so many different approaches that teachers have. And the most important thing for a teacher is to basically teach where you're at. So I teach where I'm at. And where I am is somebody who struggles a lot with my own mind. I've got my own sort of mental health challenges that I try to be honest about. I speak a lot from the place of somebody who hasn't arrived at, who hasn't crossed the Elysian fields into Never Never Land, that I'm still very much inside this place of struggle and working with it. So I'm far from the enlightened teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And that is both going to give me certain strengths as a teacher, because it's still hugely relatable to me, those struggles. But on the other hand, it may give me some that may work against me, in the sense that, one thing you could say absolutely is true with teaching is that the more experience you have practicing, the more experience you have being a human being, the deeper your wisdom about these practices. So I'm still only, I've only been practicing since 2003. So I really, I'm still I consider myself still a kind of learner teacher, But the first point, I just want to, maybe open up that a little bit. There's something that can happen with really experienced teachers, and many experienced teachers have told me this, where they get because development in a practice is a lot about moving your identification away from the conditioned experience to what's unconditioned, that the problems of the conditioned mind become more and more almost abstract for them. They lose their immediacy because they don't have those challenges as much, although they do have them in a general sense. And so it's harder for them to relate to the real suffering and challenge of somebody who hasn't been deeply established in that more unconditioned place, you could say. Yeah. So so then often Shinzo would say, well, I can't really remember what it was like certain things he'd remember, but other things he can't relate to as much. So for me, I'm very much still there. So that's what you get. It's like and I think part of it is also knowing that you don't have to be the perfect meditator yourself to be a meditation teacher. You need to be a good enough meditator, but it's a lot like being a coach, where a coach doesn't need to be a superb athlete. A coach needs to be a good coach, needs to really understand the game, and needs to know how to work with the different kinds of challenges. And because I run a community with a lot of different challenges that come to the fore, I've learned through my network of psychotherapists and emergency doctors and neurologists and neurobiologists and other spiritual teachers and other meditation teachers, we've kind of learned how to triangulate it on different challenges. So I try to draw on that that's what's behind me when I'm writing the book, that sense of a larger, wider population of expertise and an appreciation for just how hard it is to do the simplest things in meditation, like concentrate, like, come back to the breath, like see what's happening in a particular pattern of reactivity.
I mean, on that issue of great meditators sometimes not being great meditation teachers, there's a related thing with expertise in general. Like, a lot of really good scientists are incapable of explaining science to a layperson, and you're better off learning it from somebody who doesn't know as much about it, because they are somewhere intermediate between you and the actual experts.
Exactly.
And so I know what you mean. Now, Dan refers to you as the meditation MacGyver. Now, I never watched MacGyver, but just from listening to the way that word has entered the language, I gathered that MacGyver was good at coming up with different clever fixes to different hacks, for different things, right? And one of the I gather so part of your approach is that different people require different approaches, definitely. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I always joke about that what Dan really means is that I'm an ADD meditation teacher. So
Which you literally are.
I literally am. Yeah. And I practice with many, many different teachers. I've practiced many kinds of techniques in many traditions. And so I'm just interested across the board in how practice works. So when I'm meeting somebody and someone has particular challenges, I'm thinking about it from that perspective. I'm thinking, well, of all these different techniques that I've looked at and all this stuff I've learned about the mind more generally, what can I say here that would be helpful for this person at this time? And it seems to work well as an approach. And so it's also just how my brain works. I'm not really interested in one single mode of operating and digging one single deep well. Like, I dig lots of little wells, and what I found from doing that is that, it would be hopelessly ADD if that was the only thing that you did. But my interest is in finding connections between those smaller wells to understanding, well, what are the universal skills that are being built up here in all of these techniques and all of these practices? And that's what I see. So I'm always coming at it from that perspective. Like, what are the main skills here that are going to bring a person into a relationship with their life that's going to involve less suffering and more fulfillment? I can break those skills down and I can see what they're doing in the present moment that's not addressing, that's not tapping into those skills. And then I usually respond from that. But then you're also looking at things like their history, their passions, where are they already interested in? What kinds of practice are they already interested in doing? I mean, are they a sports person? Do they like physical movement? Do they like, paying attention in a particular kind of way? Do they like the more cosmic stuff? Are they more disciplined and austere? The kind of no bullshit skeptic, in which case you can work in a more analytic way. So you're kind of feeling them out, and then you play to their strengths and you speak and try to speak their language. And that's something that I'm really passionate about.
Now, having attention deficit disorder is in a certain sense a really good place for a teacher to start from, because in a certain sense, everyone has ADD, at least relative to the ideal of mindfulness, right?
Oh.
I mean, everyone who goes to a retreat and has never meditated or just sits down and tries to meditate goes, well, I guess I'm not as good at concentrating as you're supposed to be to do this, because it turns out that it's hard to pay attention to even 5 consecutive breaths. And so ADD, in a way, you're just you're the perfect teacher. Now, I have ADD too. I mean, I was actually kind of diagnosed with it. I don't think I have like an extreme version of it, and I don't think I have the hyperactive dimension so much. But let's compare notes a little on ADD. I mean, my experience, like in college, I really tried to take notes at lectures, and I never once emerged from a lecture with anything like a coherent account of what the person had said. Because for one thing, as soon as they said something, either it was too boring to pay attention to, or they would say something interesting, and that would set my mind off on a series of like related questions, right? Now, is that related to your ADD?
It sounds a little bit like it. I mean, I also have I have the hyperactivity as well, and I have something called the hyperfocus, which you may have, which is that.
No, I do not have hyperfocus.
Okay, well, that's something. It's like almost like an OCD flavor to ADD. So the hyper skipping, where if it's not interesting to me, it's very hard to pay attention. But if I am interested in something, then I just lock into it in this sort of obsessive way. And so that is.
I have a little of that, but I think you have more.
I got more, or maybe I don't know if I have more or not, but I got a lot of that. And then I also have another challenge, which is with sort of mood cycling, these up and down energy surges that may or may not be related to ADD. It may be partly a bit of a bipolar thing. I've been diagnosed with that as being a possibility. And what that feels like from the inside is I get really excited really fast, and I just suddenly shoot up this circuit, this kind of wave of energy and hyperactivity that gets me into problems with impulse control and like injuring myself and saying stupid shit, and that actually I can end up popping into like a manic state, or a hypermanic state, which I barely realized was happening. Meditation has been so helpful for this, and that I'd be inside this state of this sort of like delusional self-confidence and excitement about some creative idea, and ideas cascading out, and feels wonderful, but it took me a long time to realize that I actually wasn't really making contact with people around me. There was I was kind of in my bubble. And then always often it would be a corresponding crash where suddenly really low energy, tired, kind of bummed out. And those cycles have been with me for at least my late 20s. And it's like once a week or every 2 weeks, I'll go into a cycle like that and having no idea what was happening. And so the practice has been hugely helpful for me to notice. I mean, it's been all about that for me. I'm not the most person in the world. I'm really good at being mindful and having awareness in that more meta way of what pattern that I'm inside. And I'm always learning. I wasn't, even during the writing of this book, there was patterns that I wasn't seeing that I eventually was started to see. And then, the process goes on and on.
Yeah. Now, how much of this, I know you had kind of a life-changing experience when you fell out of a tree while on drugs when you were about 20, and I gather that exacerbated your ADD or did. And first of all, I'm curious, what drug was this?
Mushrooms.
That
Magic
was
mushrooms.
psilocybin. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the old saying, never climb a tree while on psilocybin. I guess this guidance is coming a little late to you. But anyway, you fell out of a tree and actually like did damage to your brain, right?
Yeah. I would suggest if you're on psilocybin, you should be hugging the tree. Definitely.
Yeah, right. Hug, don't climb
Hug, don't
is the
climb.
mantra for yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I was 20. I climbed this very large tree, and there was freezing rain out, and I slipped, fell sort of 30 feet, broke my neck in two places, and probably did some brain damage as well. Although that wasn't the main issue, was the broken neck, and that's what they really concentrated on. It was only later when I spoke to a neurologist, they told me about something called shearing, which is when you have a head injury, the white matter and the gray matter, which are different densities in the brain, they can sometimes sort of shear against each other a bit, and there can be some kind of neural rearranging. So from what I experienced from the inside was that my ADD got a lot worse after that injury. I felt like I was sort of coming out of it, actually. You know, I was like a lot of kids had ADD, but as I got deeper into teenage years, my ADD I felt like it was starting to get under more control. But then having this just set me back. And it was worse than it ever was, actually, worse than I ever remember it being when I was a kid even. And it just meant that I couldn't keep I kept zooming on tangents, always going on tangents. And it's become part of my natural thinking style that I still think sort of tangentially. Although, like I said, if I'm really interested, I can kind of hold on to it a little bit. But that's very frustrating. You know, and you might relate to that, you know, when someone asks you a question and you're excited to respond, and then you start responding, and all of a sudden you're thinking of something else, and you go over here and you go over here, and it can be very entertaining. You can have lots of creative responses to things, but it's not always the most practical and helpful way to move forward. However, in terms of being a meditation teacher, the silver lining of it is that you're always in the moment. You're always in the moment, you know, because you just forget what was happening the last moment. So you're just back here in the moment. Now, most of the suffering in ADD happens when you come back to the moment and you know there's something that you're forgetting that you need to be remembering over here. And so you're struggling to try to get back to it, or you have all these judgments about it, or you've just let somebody down because they're waiting for this thing and you're back here in the moment. But if you can learn to see all of that, all those judgments and all that inner turmoil around it, then it can actually become a lot more manageable. And the good news is you can build up that concentration muscle. So both whether you're on ADD without meds, and also probably if you do take meds, it can very, very much help with concentration, and the positive effects of the practice that you do when you're on meds are still going to stay. You know, it's not like they don't count because you're on meds. So I'm not on meds, but because they didn't work for me. But I know lots of people who are, and they really are thankful that they have them. So.
They didn't work in the first place. It wasn't just that, like, as a long run thing, it became too addictive or anything. They just didn't work for you.
You know, it just felt like partying, to be honest, dude. I'd take a bunch of Ritalin, and it was like, I know this feeling. I've done this many times in nightclubs. It just felt like fun and kind of partying, and I was a little buffered. But after a while, it got really old. And although the concentration was wonderful, and I suddenly understood what it was like to be normal, and that I could sit down and just systematically do one thing, and I didn't have a billion distractions. I don't want to sound a bit mystical, but it created a lot of suffering with me as well, because I couldn't feel the more spacious dimension of my awareness that I had come to, that I had just taken for granted through my meditation practice and just through being a human being. You know, there was something really rich and full in my experience that I wasn't feeling anymore. It was like, you know, something good got taken away. And when I went off the meds, that good thing came back and has been back ever since. So I may not be very concentrated, but I at least have this peace, which feels a lot like what's one of the reasons it's worth living. So to have that.
So I gather that after you fell out of a tree, you got more and more interested in the phenomenon of consciousness, and I want to turn to that before too long. But first, I guess we owe people a definition, or your definition of mindfulness, since mindfulness meditation is the kind that you practice and teach. What do you mean by mindfulness?
My favorite definition is Shinzen Young's definition, which he talks about mindfulness as a 3-part attentional skill set. that it's when you combine the three muscle groups of concentration, equanimity, and clarity, if all those are present, then that by definition is you're having a mindful experience. That's a departure from, say, the traditional way in which Buddhists would talk about mindfulness, which is its own factor, which is just being aware of what's going on. And I think that's also a legitimate way to talk about it. But the reason I like, Shinzen's way of talking about it is because it's trackable. It's like findable. It's like you can actually connect to the experience of all three: concentration, clarity, and equanimity. You can figure out what that feels like, what they all feel like, and then that way you get feedback that you're actually being mindful. Mm-hmm. So it's very practical, and it's very it's more disciplined as a description. I like that.
And maybe we should say that concentration is the entry point to a number of different kinds of meditation in Buddhism. So, when you focus on your breath, you're trying to concentrate, but if you just do nothing but tighten and heighten that focus and get more and more into your breath, which is an interesting thing to do and can lead your mind to really spectacular places. But if that's what you do, that's not mindfulness, right? I mean, the point with mindfulness, you establish the focus, but then you do something with it other than tighten it, right?
That's right. So the fundamental distinction between that Buddhists make between concentration and mindfulness, which are two, so shamatha and vipassana, they're considered two separate practices, although they reinforce each other. And most of them will say that concentration is sort of the place where you begin, although they'll also say begin with with ethics and ethical practices. But concentration creates stability in the mind. And then if you were to only do concentration, it's really about creating simplicity in the mind, this sort of single one-pointedness where you unify all the parts of the mind. So it's all doing one thing, which is just paying attention to the breath or to whatever it is. And the act of doing that is very peaceful, leads to a lot of stability and focus. And it's a wonder, and it leads ultimately into the jhanas and the bliss states, and it's lovely. But you're basically merging one-pointedly with the object, as opposed to a mindfulness practice, which is basically maintaining a kind of more meta perspective. So you're popped out a bit. You're noticing how a particular stimuli, if it's the breath, say, how it changes. You're noticing its sort of vibratory qualities. You're not embedded in it. You have a certain amount of kind of space around that. You have an observational stance. And the idea there is that if you have concentration first, it can really help create a lot of stability. Then you can use that awareness as a departure point for basically deconstructing the objects of mind and whatever's happening in your experience. And within a Theravada context, what they're interested in particular is kind of connecting to what they call the three characteristics of reality, which is just the three characteristics of the conditioned mind, that it's constantly changing, that if you're able to observe it, that by definition there's no you in it. And then also that there's a kind of duality or tension, a kind of suffering, dukkha quality in the observation itself.
Right. So impermanence, excuse me, and not self, which we probably needn't get much further into now, and dukkha or suffering, and are said to be these three characteristics of reality that you come to appreciate through meditation.
Through insight meditation.
Through insight meditation. Yeah, you use the word vipassana, which is translated as insight, is closely associated with mindfulness. And mindfulness is the kind of standard technique for gaining insight through meditation. The suffering part is interesting because you could also the word for suffering, dukkha, is sometimes translated as unsatisfactoriness, and that's really, I think, in a way, the easiest way for people to relate to the idea that it really is a pervasive thing. Because most people say, look, I'm not always suffering. If you translate dukkha as suffering, I'm not always suffering. And you could argue with them about it and say, look deeper, you really are. But I think one thing people can relate to is just how often they are not completely happy with the situation. Just how naturally the mind, okay, granted, maybe there's a moment of satisfaction, but still, it is just in the nature of the mind to just so instinctively and immediately look for ways to make things a little better. And this makes sense when you think of the human mind as a product of evolution. You want animals to be I mean, natural selection would want animals to be restless, always trying to find better food and mates and get their genes in the next generation, but it's just not a recipe for happiness. So, in your experience, this is really what you think of as dukkha, right? Just the fact that you naturally want things to be a little different than they are at any given moment.
Yeah, I kind of think of it as two things. I think of it as exactly what you're describing, which is that kind of constant, slight, restless agitation, need to move, need to grip, need to manage. And that comes from, constantly trying to, in a sense, control or manage your experience. Like get rid of the stuff you don't like and hold on to the stuff you do like, which I understand you've written about in your new book. And that's my primary form personally of experiencing dukkha. But there's also this other sense in which some teachers talk about dukkha, which is as this fundamental sort of alienation, that there's a sense in which we're alienated from experience because we imagine we're a subject over here looking at an object over here. And that in the Buddhist view, and indeed in the view of Indian philosophy, that is a artificial duality. Although it's very real as an experience, there's only one thing in reality, and it's possible to experience reality as being part of that one thing as opposed to part of that separation. And that being in that separation part creates this tension that's constantly trying to keep this separation. There's a kind of tension that's always keeping an object out there and a subject in here. And one teacher I like talks about it as a lack of synchrony, that it's like there's a kind of timing problem, between like the world out there is experience and the world in here, that they're kind of seen as two things, and that there's something queasy and uneasy about that. I experience it more as this alienation that can emerge where I just feel that like disconnected from things in some way, or not as, and then I've had many experiences in practice where that kind of goes away, and then I don't feel any dukkha whatsoever.
And is that also a movement toward not self? If because the separation between you and the rest of reality is diminishing.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think that's the one thing I'm really interested in trying to communicate to people is that these lofty notions of no self and enlightenment and awakening and all those things, there are dramatic shifts that can happen in that direction, that there are certainly reports of that, but that they're really not that exotic. It's a continuum of feeling yourself to be part of what's going on around you. And we all have had experiences like that. They're so common, we barely pay attention to them. But when it's just that it gets deeper with time, that quality can start to infuse your experience more fully and get deeper and deeper until you start to appreciate the contrast of it. But yeah, I would say what they say within the traditional Theravada context is the dukkha, the no self, and the suffering, the no self, and the impermanence. All three of those things kind of become a single insight at a certain point in the practice where you see that they're all part and parcel of the same thing.
Mm-hmm. So mindfulness, so as defined by Shinzen Young, then mindfulness has these three elements of like concentration, equanimity, and clarity. Was that the third? And you can see how they're related. I mean, so as I said, you start with concentration, but you don't get single-mindedly immersed in any one thing. On the other hand, the clarity, I think, comes from your ability to transfer the concentration to whatever it's appropriate to focus on at the moment, right? And that's why it isn't just concentration meditation, because you're able to apply it broadly. Your awareness is broad and not narrowed, and yet you're capable of bringing that focus to individual things within the field of awareness. And then the equanimity is just in a way. Go ahead.
And make discernments. So you're looking at what's happening in your awareness, and you're starting to make discernments about what you're seeing and how it's operating.
Right.
That's the kind of clarity piece.
Right, and the equanimity, it both results from the practice, but it also facilitates the application of concentration to the appropriate thing. Right. It's because you're not being pushed and pulled by the feelings that might push and pull you when you're in an unreflective mode, that your attention is being kind of wisely and appropriately focused.
Yeah, that's well said. I think of it as a lack of friction. So equanimity is just if you're able to be very, very, very calm and centered in your experience, you're not creating this natural friction between things that can arise. So you're able to make out the signal more clearly. It's like there's less obscuration of it. The signal of each individual sensation is clearer. So they all work together. You get concentrated, you get calm. It creates more smoothness and less friction, which in turn creates more clarity. So there's this continual, all three of those qualities are reinforcing each other. And that dynamic itself is, that's like the fundamental thing you need to understand in terms of how the practice deepens. The more you're able to be clear, the more you're able to notice and accept new subtleties in your experience through the accepting, the opening, the lack of friction, that pattern can begin to be metabolized, or that is the experience. The experience is that it's no longer coagulated or frozen in the same way, but it can start to get kind of opened up, and the kind of energy of it. I just use energy in quotation marks. I don't know how else to call it. Because we're talking about consciousness, the material, the stuff in consciousness gets more free flowing, and that is what deepening in the practice is all about. It's about becoming less and less stuck and coagulated in this fixed position, and so that all of your experience starts to become more free flowing, and you yourself start to experience yourself as more free flowing in the world. That is the nature of the transformation, at least from the perspective of an insight or mindfulness perspective. One way to talk about it, because there's lots of ways to talk about it.
And it's nice, I got to say. I mean, it's not. I mean, I meditate, and my life is better than it would be if I didn't meditate. But at the same time, it's not like the quality of my life is quite what it is on, say, day 6 of a good meditation retreat. But the value of a meditation retreat is it just shows you what is possible, what the human mind can be like, and gives you something to aspire to. Now, it shows you what's possible. It gives you perspective on your life, and it also can happen that you can have a breakthrough that leaves you at a new level of concentration or a new level of equanimity. It's like there are these permanent baseline shifts as well. It's not only the rule use it or lose it. Use it or lose it is absolutely true in meditation, but the literature is also filled with people describing examples where they have a breakthrough and they now have a level of insight or concentration. It could be different things that seems to be the new baseline. Mm-hmm. And that happen. And that's really important to say, because there can come to a point where you kind of get to a point of no return, where all of a sudden the practice, as Shinzen would say, the practice is doing you. That you still practice, and it's still important to practice, but there's a sense in which the momentum of the practice has you, and that for the rest of your days, it's going to continue to unfold. And that certainly has happened with me. And it's like, I don't even when I'm not doing a formal sitting practice, I can feel the practice in me. I can feel, it's so automatic paying attention in a kind of more mindful way that I can't unlearn it. It's like, mm-hmm. It's just, and I'm relatively shallow as a practitioner and teacher compared to some of my elders and my teachers who are like, talking to Shinzen about his experience of reality is pretty fucking fascinating, Yeah. Yeah, he's devoted a lot of time to this, and he started young. So we said we'd talk about consciousness, and we're clearly kind of heading there. I want to just one pit stop before we do. You said you're working on a book about, or you have been for some time working on a book about awakening, or at least that's the way you were conceiving it when you started. Awakening is a term that's tantamount to what is more commonly in English called enlightenment. But the terms basically mean the same thing. Do you want to quickly say anything about that before we turn to consciousness and its nature and mysteries? What do you mean by awakening? What thoughts do you have about it?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't talk about it actually tons anymore. I kind of feel like I went a bit crazy trying to write this book. The history for me around thinking about it was when I wrote my first book about consciousness. Of course, I'd read all about this awakening, and I just kind of thought it was, I just didn't even know how to begin to relate to it. I could talk about, I just seemed like a kind of religious fantasy, to be honest. So I understood that people had these deep experiences, but I just didn't think, it felt like it was too much describing that you could win at life. And I just didn't understand how that could be possible. But as I got deeper and deeper into practice and met a lot of different teachers, I met people like Shinzen and many others who would start to talk about their experience. And I could start to understand how those narratives, how their experience could match what the awakening looked like.
Okay.
And then I could start to see it myself.
There was just a glitch. Can you just repeat the last sentence, Jeff?
Sure. So I was saying that as I began to talk to other practitioners and other teachers, I began to hear in their accounts of how they had changed through their meditation practice a kind of resonance or with what I was reading in the books about descriptions of this sort of lofty state. And I began to see how it was there in their experience. And actually, it was there in all the experience of meditators. It was there in my experience in terms of when you start to understand how equanimity works, how accepting works, how softening kind of the rigid, controlling self works. So my understanding was that I started to see how there was actually a continuum of transformation that happened to practitioners, and that many people talked about awakening and enlightenment in different ways. It's just a word after all. But generally, what it meant was deepening along that continuum, and that where most people seem to have a gradual progression, some people would have a very dramatic shift where they would sort of jump up, you could say, a large ways, and that created a huge contrast. And then they would say they were awakened. You see that happen in both a Buddhist and in a non-dual perspectives. Like there's lots of examples of that. So what they meant by it, the way I understand it, and of course everyone is going to describe it a bit differently, but the way I understand it is really it's about beginning to understand yourself not as this separate, bounded, discrete thing, but as this process that's connected to the larger process and dependent on the larger process of the world around you. And that you can actually start to experience yourself in this more light and unfixated way as just something else happening in nature, that you don't reify your own experience in the same way, although you respect that you're having it and you still have your personality and all the rest of it. And that there's a kind of lightness that starts to come into there's different changes that happen as you move along within that. But that some of the common ones are more equanimity, more easygoingness, often a natural desire because you're not trying to hold on to your shit so much. You have more energy and more openness to helping other people. And then other things, other qualities as well. But that's sort of one way to talk about oneness is just feeling connected to the world around you, knowing that you are part of you're all part of one thing, and letting that process sort of work its way through you. Now that's a fairly unexotic way to describe it, but that's the part that's how I feel, and that's how I hear it described by some teachers. Now, I also think that muddying this a little bit is there's another kind of, I would call it another axis that's sort of orthogonal to this one that has to do with the special effects. Because there are people who just have very strong, juicy, weird, spiritual special effects. I call them like they have a wet process versus a dry process. So they have Kundalini activations up the spine. They have very dramatic arising and passing, very strong sense of emptiness flowing in from the outside, a sense of themselves as not being in the center, but located everywhere. There's many different kinds of spiritual special effects that can happen. And you could be someone very deep practitioner within a practice who, by all intents and purposes, is living in a kind of oneness, who's very enlightened, who has none of that. Or you could be someone who's a relatively shallow practitioner who's getting lots of those special effects and confusing it in this sort of grandiose way with deeper benefits down the line. So it is a complicated subject. And what I was trying to do with that book was to try to just describe some of the main terrains that practitioners move through and use a lot of quotes and anecdotes from actual practitioners and teachers that kind of filled it out. And I probably will come back to it at some point. But where I was going crazy was I kept thinking I could really nail it. I could get it right. I could understand exactly what awakening was. I could find the right metaphor for it. So I kept coming up with a new metaphor and really describing all the aspects of it, because there are many aspects to it. And then I would realize that I was incomplete, that there was some part of it that I wasn't accounting for, and then I'd have to throw it all out and start all over again. And I realized I would never be able to understand it, that it was just the process is so paradoxical. It was just beyond my chimpanzee brain to really totally get. So I had to kind of take a bite of humble pie and just chill for a bit on that.
So you think you may pick that book up and finish it yet, or?
Yeah, I think I'll pick it up and finish it, but the first thing I'll say in it is like, this is a book written by a dude who barely knows anything. And from what I can tell, this seems to be some of the patterns and some of the things I've learned and some of the things I've heard, and these are what some of the people have told me. And mostly I just want to honor the anecdotes, but ultimately you're going to have to figure this out for yourself, because I think that there are as many kinds of awakenings as there are individuals on the planet. And I don't think that Buddhism has a monopoly on, or even indeed Eastern philosophy or Eastern practices. I think that this notion of coming more fully into the world is there all or in every culture, and it's experienced in different ways. And there's it's it's a very interesting subject. I mean, the reason it matters is because it leads people almost across the board to experiencing their lives with more fulfillment, with less suffering, with more caring for others. That's why it's worth the bother, with more meaning. And I wish we could have this conversation more within secular society. I think we get a lot of the same things from art, from secular practices, and I wish we could talk about the mysterious dimension of that is there. But right now in the secular world, any description of this stuff, it smacks of mysticism or it smacks of religiosity, and then people just kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater. But we should be able to, like William James, have an intelligent conversation about mystical and religious experience without having to create a whole bunch of reactivity.
Okay, well, William James is a good segue to the subject of consciousness more broadly. So the subject got your attention after this falling out of a tree thing? Is that right? And why was that? What was it about your post-tree experience that led you to start thinking about consciousness?
Well, I was experiencing the world completely differently. So I was like, what the fuck happened?
And what was the difference again?
It was much more, I was way more kind of, I guess I would describe it as associative. So I couldn't hold on to my train of thinking in the same way. I would just jump around in a much more.
So you had been somewhat ADD before this, but you got more so, basically?
More so after. But I also was having, I guess I could say, I mean, I was a party animal. I was doing psychedelics. I was having these psychedelic experiences where I would, merge with things, or I'd have these profound insights into what felt like reality. And I wanted to know what was going on. Because when you have those experiences, often it's insights about consciousness that you're having. You don't know what to necessarily make of them. You don't know whether to value them or just to write them off as just something that was caused by the drugs. But it definitely piqued a real interest in me. One that had been there before when I was younger. I had lots of weird experiences when I was younger too, sort of lucid dreaming experiences where I'd wake up in my dreams and be like, what is going on? Or experiences of kind of more cosmic-y things that I didn't know what was going on. I just would be hanging out in my room or falling asleep, and I'd be having these experiences. So I'd always had a low-level interest, but now after this accident, it really took off. So I just started reading all the books I could find on it, figuring that there's a
like what books?
Like everything. I mean,
for people listening to the audio podcast, Jeff is now training his camera on his bookshelf.
I mean,
many of the books apparently are related to consciousness.
Buddhist books, books about like Edelman, the latest books about neurobiology. This is a great book, Sue Blackmore, Conversations on Consciousness.
Oh yeah.
I mean, just Damasio, Alan Hobson, everything, and really trying to understand it from also a wider perspective. So not just the neurobiology and the philosophy of mind, but the neuroscience, or the contemplative stuff, the cultural stuff. There's stuff on how consciousness changed through history based on that people look at texts we've written, like literature, and how it's changed. So I wanted to try to understand it, anthropologists, So I kind of just went nuts in an ADD way, reading very indiscriminately. And eventually what I realized was that what I was really interested in was like inner experience. Like what was our own experience of reality like, and how did it change over 24 hours? So I got really interested in sleep and dreaming and the biology of sleep and dreaming, and trying to figure out how that linked to different experiences that other people were having, that I was having. And then the book just resulted in kind of a taxonomy of these different states of consciousness. So.
And have you had any great realizations about consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, one is that just like William James said, that there are these very fundamental different states of knowing, that the way in which we know the world through a dream versus through waking versus through slow wave sleep, deep sleep versus through, say, a deep meditative state are different. And that each of those ways in which we know has its own kind of knowledge that's valuable, that gives us, there's insights to be had there. That's sort of obvious, I guess, but I didn't know when I went into it. Another one is just the role of expectations plays on our experience. So there's a sort of naive idea even within Buddhist Christianism that they're discovering or seeing something about the nature of the mind, and as if their own looking were different than the thing they were noticing. But in fact, the act of looking and the expectations we have, our own cultural sets we bring to it, shape the kinds of things we find. So that's a huge thing to understand, that we're both discovering things in the mind and we're also training the mind at the same time. So no, that was a big takeaway from my book, was the role of expectations, like the way in which we bring these ideas to the table when we're looking at consciousness, and then also just how damn fun the whole thing is. Because I mean, basically, your brain can be remixed, your consciousness can be remixed. You can boot up different elements of different states in other states. So you can boot up waking awareness inside a dream and have a lucid dream. You can be partly dreaming when you're awake, when you're daydreaming. You can apparently thread a kind of witnessing consciousness through deep, slow wave sleep, where you're actually wake up inside this state of very little going on and be aware.
Mm-hmm.
This is all really fascinating to me, that we have this, we live in this much more rich and multidimensional experience than we typically realize.
Now, so you did some lucid dreaming when you were a kid?
Yeah. Now,
do you know? Have you read any books by? I think it's Evan Thompson.
He's my friend.
He's your friend.
Yeah. His book, Waking Sleeping Being.
Yeah, that's a great book.
I mean,
he's an unusual combination of kind of like depth of conscious experience and analytical and expository ability, I would say. It's like there's these people who they talk to you and you're convinced they've gone deep, but they can't talk about it clearly. And then he's an interesting combination. But I remember I had a conversation with him on this platform, and I said something, I think, as I recall the exchange, I said, so dreaming is to lucid dreaming as ordinary consciousness is to what? And I think he said mindfulness, which makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Lucid dreaming is just mindfulness in the dream. It's so you pop out of the trance, because dreams are very sticky. And when you're in a dream, you're not challenging the weirdness of what's going on. You just take it on face value. So if you're inside a herd of elephants, riding a herd of elephants, and you're on a yellow balloon or something, you don't ever think it's weird. So in a lucid dream, you suddenly pop out of that trance and you understand, you come back to the larger context, which is that your body's sleeping in the world and you're inside a dream, and that gives you a certain amount of freedom for how you then act.
Right. And it's like, well, go ahead.
Well, it's basically like almost identical transition that happens, but it isn't just like, I wouldn't say it's just waking to mindfulness. That's like the small version. The large version is waking to awakening, to being permanently in a place where you recognize that this sense of separation that you've been going around with as just this no-brainer is actually just one perspective from that you could have, and you can actually see the exact same thing in a different perspective. But it's hard to know how to do that. It's like we think, so meditation tries to train you up so you can kind of have a spontaneous accidental experience of that. But what every non-dual teacher will tell you is that you can actually come to that perspective immediately at any moment. But
you can, but I think you got to be lucky. I mean, it's like, apparently that happened to Eckhart Tolle. On the other hand, he had to do what? Sleep on a park bench for 3 years first, or whatever the hell it was.
Permanent happened to him, but you can very easily have a temporary experience of feeling a little bit more non-dually. I mean, that's most non-dual.
People report that. I haven't had a lot of that myself, but I do. To get back to the retreat experience, it's like my first meditation retreat. It's like by the end of it, you're going like, wow. So the way my ordinary consciousness was just deeply suspect. It doesn't have to be that way. And it's like, it's hard to convey to people, because when you say, I started my last book by talking about the movie The Matrix. And on the one hand, obviously that's a little hyperbolic, maybe as a description of our ordinary consciousness, to say that it's actually a delusion perpetrated on us by these brains created by natural selection. That's my basic storyline. But on the one hand, yes, it's hyperbolic. On the other hand, speaking of someone who has not attained enlightenment, but has had a pretty dramatic shift of consciousness, on a meditation retreat or two, and to varying degrees in everyday life, you can get to this point where you realize, whoa, it can just be so different. Your way of being can be so different than the way it normally is. And if you ask, well, what does it consist of? Well, it consists of things like just, as cliched as this sounds, it consists of things like not obsessively making judgments. And you don't just mean making judgments about people, although that's part of it. You do spend a lot of time evaluating people and like reacting accordingly, and friend or enemy or something. That eats up a lot of energy, but the truth is you just do that about everything. And a lot of the transformation consists of just liberation from that. And the fact that it's such a dramatic transformation is testament to how pervasively we ordinarily do that without even really thinking about it,
Yeah, the metaphor I sometimes use is it's like you've been hanging out in the kitchen for ages, and suddenly the sound of the fridge goes off, and it's like, wow, it's dramatic.
Right.
You didn't even notice the sound of the
you didn't even realize it was on. You thought that was ordinary reality.
You thought that was ordinary reality. And it's a lot like that all the endless negotiation and friction that's going on in the background that you don't even realize is there because it's just the norm can cut out, or it can just drop out a lot. And then there's a lot of, from that place, it's a lot more enjoyable.
And I want to say something about that in ordinary meditative experience, because we've talked about retreats, we've talked about enlightenment. Some people don't have time to go on retreats, or maybe they can go on one and kind of get the picture, but it's hard to keep going back. But and it's true that in my experience, it is often the case that in my daily meditation, I am so far from some kind of master meditator. It's like I'm going 15 minutes before I focus on 7 consecutive breaths, literally. But what I want to say is this: even when that's the case, when you get to the 7th or 8th or 9th or 10th breath, it may take 15 minutes. In a given morning, it may not happen at all, but it's doable. And when it happens, even though 8, 9, 10 breaths isn't many, in my experience, just focusing for that long can be like suddenly the refrigerator goes off. It's like it's a moment. It's a threshold where there's just a sudden kind of calm that descends, and it doesn't sound that profound to calm down a little, but there is something profound feeling about it. Yeah. Even though you've done it a lot, and it resulted from something pretty trivial, which is just focusing on a few consecutive breaths.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that part of what part of what you're tasting, people often talk about this in negative terms, like it's getting rid of the inner talk, it's getting rid of the this, that, and the other. But there's also a positive way to talk about it, which is when that stuff is removed, something else sort of enters into your experience. And it's a kind of, a kind of natural intimacy with the world around you, or this. People talk about it in different ways, a spaciousness or a relaxedness, but you feel the connection with your life more, or at least I do. And I've not just my life, the mystery of your life. Like there's something, it suddenly becomes just fulfilling sitting there, not doing anything. And that's really interesting. And I think most people will be able to relate to having spontaneously dropping into things when that happens in nature or different things like that. But meditation seems to be a place where that can help make that happen more frequently. So I like how you talk about that.
Yeah. And just one more word on consciousness. You mentioned William James, and a point he makes, I think, effectively in Varieties of Religious Experiences. One particular passage where he just says, like ordinary consciousness, it's just one of many possible consciousnesses. Yeah. And, he does things like he experiments with drugs. He takes nitrous oxide and reports on it. And that is, for me, a big take home of the book. Not that all experiences are equally valid. And in fact, Buddhism has pretty clear ideas about which experiences are valid. It's not like any departure from ordinary consciousness is enlightenment. But still, the point is just you shouldn't make the assumption that your ordinary way of going through life is the clearest possible view of things.
Yeah, although, I guess I would just add to that, I think there's a difference between, I think this is really important to say, and I think this is something that a lot of teachers maybe don't talk about, but that there's one thing is your experience, and what part of your subjective experience is going to make you feel better. How can you relate to your own life in a way that is going to make you happier and feel more connected? And that's a kind of, so it's about coming into a healthier relationship with yourself. And that's different than having an accurate understanding of the objective experience of reality. And I think that sometimes within mystics, mystics will say, yes, this is the truth. And now they mean the truth in both those ways. And for them, it converges that the truth of living without suffering is the same as an objective understanding of reality. I don't know that those two things are the same. I'm more on the Bertrand Russell side, who loves mysticism, thinks it represents some of the greatest things in humanity, because that insight of oneness frees you up so often to be of service. It can create good people. And this is what James talked about too. So there's certainly the deep value in that. But he said that you can't then argue from within that subjective bubble that that's a true description of objective reality, because how could you ever get outside of your bubble to see what objective reality looks like? Mysticism says that it's a paradox. You can. I don't know. I never think my experience is more than just me having an experience, but I can say I feel more fulfilled in my life, and there's less suffering.
Yeah, I actually defend the claim in my latest book that yes, it is drawing you toward clarity. That the Buddhists claim that there is a convergence between becoming a better person and a happier person, and actually seeing the world more clearly. I defend the claim not on the basis of having attained enlightenment, but via other arguments. But speaking of books, let's talk a little more about your book in closing, because there's a lot to recommend the book. I've already said some of it in my conversation with Dan, and said that I'm glad I've read it, because people have asked me, like, what's a good book, a how-to book, if you've tried to meditate, it hasn't worked, or you're just not sure it's worth the trouble. And now I have a book to recommend, because this is the best one in that genre that I've read, and it revolves around your own teaching technique. And there are a lot of chapters that are named after common objections or sources of skepticism, like I can't do this, I can't meditate, I don't have time for this, people might think I'm weird, meditation is self-indulgent. I think we've taken care of the meditation is self-indulgent thing just by virtue of having said you think it makes you a better person, right? I mean, ultimately, it benefits people other than you, regardless of whether you were drawn into it for essentially therapeutic reasons, right? Is that fair to?
I think so. I think for a lot of people, it just makes you less of a reactive dickhead. So you're nicer to be around, and you're more actually available for what other people are dealing with. It could be as simple as that.
Yeah, isn't that actually a quote from ancient Buddhist text? It makes you less of a reactive dickhead.
I think the Buddha said it after a particularly invigorating party in the forest.
Yeah. So I think that's and so now in closing, why don't you talk about this one other chapter title? Common source of skepticism is the belief that, quote, if I get too happy, I'll lose my edge. Now that's a natural concern, and I don't think it's easily dismissed, because after all, what we've just said is it makes you more at peace with things, maybe less bent on bending everything to your will, and so on. Yeah. So it influences at least the nature of your motivation, presumably. So what's your standard reaction to the complaint that you'll lose your edge if you meditate?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really seen that. I have slightly different opinion than Dan on this. What Dan would say, and I agree with him, is that generally it just helps you make better decisions. That it's about creating more efficiency in your responses. When there's less reactivity happening, you can actually have a saner, clearer view of what's going on, and so you can then respond more effectively. I absolutely believe that. But I would also say that, I understand why people say that, because insofar as you were fixated before, insofar as you thought you need to do this because in this sort of more fixated way, and your style of doing things was very fixated and driven, when that fixation and drivenness drops out, whatever edge was associated with that can actually diminish a little bit. So sometimes there is a period of having to learn a new way of being, where you're no longer trying to push things forward the way you once did, but you're more trusting things to resolve themselves. And then you're just being more disciplined and intelligent about when you need to actually step in. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of skillful means there. And for me, I definitely remember having friends say, it seems like you lost your edge. Because before I was always trying to be witty and trying to be funny, and I would like trying to be the, stay up latest and do the most crazy stuff. And as I started meditating more, I realized that I didn't need to be proving myself in that way anymore. And so that whole neurotic complex just dropped out, and I felt much more peaceful. And maybe I wasn't as, some of how I was related to that was appealing to them in that particular culture, but it wasn't actually doing me any good inside. And it really wasn't helping my relationships either. And so when that cut out, I say good riddance, but it can be true that your priorities shift a little bit, mm-hmm. And your way of being shifts a little bit. And I think that if you don't, give people a heads up about that, and you should, because that can definitely happen.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you again. The book is Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics, by Dan Harrison and Jeff Warren, with an assist from Carlisle Adler, who accompanied you on this trip, among other things, and kept you two in line. And I should say, there's a lot in the book we haven't talked about. There is the wild and crazy times on this trip you took, and there's just a lot of meditation instruction and a lot of addressing particular problems people might have with meditation. So people can buy the book. It's a New York Times bestseller. But also, if they're interested, you have a teaching practice. I don't know how accessible it is for people who can't just show up at your door. What? Are there like online resources or social media feeds you would direct people to?
Yeah, the main resource is my website, jeffwarren.org. I have an online course that's coming out for more remote folks. I do travel to do some retreats, so I've got a couple retreats coming up in Ontario this summer. I'll be in Costa Rica. I'll be in New Mexico. I'll probably have other ones as well. So I like traveling to speak and to teach. Teaching is so much fun, and I like to be able to try to get people into some of these, both the ordinariness of meditation practice, but also some of the more interesting and unusual things that can happen too. So people are welcome to, check out my website and drop me a line or whatever.
Okay. Well, I encourage that. I think they'll be the better for it. Well,
I should also say that, I'm on all the books, meditations are on the 10% Happier app. And I have a ton of meditations.
Right. I forgot. Yeah, you are part of Dan Harris's entire juggernaut of a media empire, media mindfulness empire. So there's the 10% Happier meditation app, which is another thing I'm sure you and Dan would both recommend people try. And you feature prominently in that. They can come across your teachings on that smartphone app, the 10% Happier app, right?
And one of the things that's really cool about that app that I think is so interesting is that, I guess, for people who are subscribers, they literally have a call center with meditation teachers who are taking questions. So you got any kind of question or challenge or something that's happening in your practice, they connect you with these experienced teachers. Really? So I always laugh because to me it seems like the weird future of meditation, all these Buddhist monks in call centers answering questions with practitioners. So that's
the premium version of the app.
That's the premium version of the app.
That's not the free version, but people can start with the free version. They can get some of you with the free version, right?
Oh, yeah. They can get lots of me, I think, with the free version.
Okay, and actually, then they can decide.
There's tons of free meditations on my website if people want. You don't need to give your email or anything. It's all there.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Jeff, and congratulations on the book.
Sure. Thank you, Bob. It was good to chat with you.